When they see US soldiers on UK soil kind of nonchalantly just ferrying £2,000 bombs around the place to go and drop them in the context of an illegal war, I think a lot of the British public were quite shocked.
Donald Trump is angry at Britain for supposedly not helping enough with his attack on Iran.
I was very surprised with the United Kingdom.
You know, unfortunately, Keir is not Winston Churchill.
Meanwhile, Keir Starmer is claiming Britain isn't involved at all.
We will not be drawn into the wider war.
But deep in the English countryside, there's a fleet of American warplanes that are going to bomb Iran every single day.
The government cannot claim that somehow or other a bomber taking off from RAF Fairford, bombing targets in Iran and returning, is some kind of defensive action. It is nonsense.
So what's really going on? What's the truth about Britain's role in this illegal war? And is Keir Starmer lying to the public? To find out more, I've travelled with my colleague John McAvoy 2 hours west of London to RAF Fairford in Gloucestershire to this very controversial airbase. And we've been filming today, trying to investigate what's going on. What have we found?
There's a significant amount of heavy US bombers stationed here at RAF Fairford. There's several B-52s. Around a quarter to half of the US fleet of B-1s are also stationed here. At one point we actually saw one of the B-1s taking off, presumably heading over to bomb Iran. We've also seen a number of £2,000 bombs just stationed, kind of dotted around the airway here. And earlier this week, some US soldiers were pictured on this airfield transporting those bombs around. And so what we found today when we arrived was that a lot of the fence around the airfield had been tarpaulinged off, basically fenced off, so that journalists and members of the public can actually see into the base to see what's going on here. And that doesn't scream, you know, a defensive operation to me. The US forces, which control this base, are hiding, concealing what they're doing behind the fence.
And one of those B-1 bomber aircraft actually took off right over your head, didn't it? How did that feel?
Yeah, it was quite shocking, to be honest. It went, basically I was at the far end of the runway. It kind of appeared in the distance and then it kind of went over my head, maybe about 500 feet over my head. And the sound of it, the roar from the engine, was genuinely shocking. It made me shake. You'll probably see on the video later that it was quite shaky once it went over my head. So it's kind of shocking to be in this close proximity, not only to the planes themselves, but also to these £2,000 bombs that we can see on the runway, and knowing that within 6-8 hours, that could be dropped on a school in Iran, it could be dropped on a mosque. And just last week, Iran's Red Crescent found that the US and Israel had already bombed 20,000 civilian structures in Iran, 17,000 of which are residential buildings. So we don't know whether that bomb that we've seen on the runway earlier and that B-1 that flew over my head is going to go over to Iran and drop that on school children, civilians, who knows.
And of course, right at the very start of this war, there was that terrible airstrike on the school in Manab, the girls' school. Over 170 people killed in that strike. And yet Keir Starmer still gave permission to Trump after that to go and use these bases, which he'd initially refused. So there's the base here at RAF Fairford, and there's one in Diego Garcia in the Indian Ocean. And these are quite unusual in that they have very, very long runways. This base was actually used for the space shuttle as an emergency landing site. And these bomber aircraft need very long runways to take off from, and this is the only one in Europe that the US Air Force has access to. So this is why these sites are so critically important for Starmer to let Trump use them. But he's created this caveat of saying it's only for defensive strikes. I mean, what do you make of that, John? Is there really a way that the UK can monitor that?
I mean, first of all, as a basic principle, the US and Israel have launched an illegal war on Iran. There was no UN resolution to support this war, and also there was no clear evidence at all of an imminent threat from Iran. And that's even come out in the media today that Jonathan Powell, the UK National Security Advisor, was actually involved in some of these meetings, and he came back to the UK and briefed Starmer and briefed the government that there was no clear imminent threat from Iran. And, you know, therefore, logically, this war was illegal. And it seems like a paradox to me to say that you can aid defensively in an illegal war. Yet the other problem with this is we don't know where the US bombers are going. We don't have targeting lists. We're not even sure if the UK government is being provided accurate targeting lists. You know, Trump could be saying we're going to bomb X site and in fact goes on to bomb Y site. And in any case, there's a major problem with the US targeting in general. They're clearly using AI. We've seen a park called Police Park targeted because presumably it had the word police in it through an AI process. We've seen another school targeted yesterday. And so we're not sure about how that targeting process actually works. And even then, if you listen to the words of US Secretary of War Pete Hegseth and others, they're effectively saying that, you know, we no longer have to abide by rules of engagement. We're no longer going to fight a woke war.
No stupid rules of engagement, no nation-building quagmire, no democracy-building exercise, no politically correct wars.
The only ones that need to be worried right now are Iranians that think they're going to live.
So if you actually listen to what they're saying, they don't seem to be concerned about bombing civilian strikes whatsoever. And I think that's reflected on the ground as well when you see the number of UNESCO sites, civilian infrastructure that's been pummeled at the moment.
We put quite a serious set of questions to the Ministry of Defence about the use of these bases, and they refused to answer any of them. One of them was about whether cluster bombs would be allowed to be used from these bases. The UK has signed a treaty banning the use of cluster bombs, but from WikiLeaks we know that David Miliband, who was the Foreign Secretary at the time, created a secret carve-out, allowing the US to temporarily use cluster bombs in exceptional circumstances. They had ships off Diego Garcia storing those weapons. So again, we don't know if they'll be allowed to use those weapons from this base. We also asked about blackout bombs or graphite bombs that can take out a country's power supply, because Trump's been threatening to turn off Iran's electricity.
To take apart their electric capacity within 1 hour, and it would take them 25 years to rebuild it.
And again, they refused to comment on that. They also refused to comment on whether they would announce when civilians have been killed via US strikes from these bases. So even if Starmer claims to have this defensive posture, when you try and get them to give detail on how that's even going to work, they just said, we're not going to give a running commentary, which is a bit like the tarpaulins going up here. It seems like they don't really want that much scrutiny.
Yeah, I mean, there's a total deficit of democracy when it comes to UK foreign policy in general. But when it comes to the US-UK so-called special relationship, I think that deficit of democracy is even worse. So we have no idea really what the US is doing with these sites. And another important thing to note is we have no idea about what's going on in terms of the US-UK intelligence relationship in the region. It's likely that the GCHQ base in Oman, for example, is being used in this war. But this is another thing that we're not allowed to know anything about. You can't ask parliamentary questions about it. You'll be told that we don't comment on intelligence matters. So there's a whole host of issues here that not only the British public, but also Parliament is not allowed to know about, and I think it's massively concerning.
And what do you think about the way the media's been covering this issue of American bases? Because just beyond this wire is effectively American soil as far as they're concerned. There was a local BBC crew that wanted to interview me earlier, and they just wanted to ask about the impact on the local area in terms of lots of plane spotters have come here. They wanted to ask about whether people are peeing in the bushes, and I was trying to talk about the world politics of what was happening, and they weren't really interested in that. I mean, what do you think of the media coverage that we've seen of this situation?
Yeah, I think broadly they've lapped up what Keir Starmer's been saying. I saw a BBC reporter outside of Fairford about a week ago who was basically presenting the government's case on its behalf. He kept saying that these are only being allowed for defensive strikes without kind of clarifying what precisely that might mean in practice, what kind of oversight there is over that. But the other thing that I've noticed in the past 3 or 4 days is that the media's repeatedly said, we've seen in The Guardian, we've seen like elsewhere in the past week, that public opinion is with Keir Starmer on this. Now, this is factually incorrect. Now, obviously, the public are happy not to see RAF jets going over and bombing Iran, but that does not therefore mean that the British public is with Keir Starmer. If you read any of the recent polling, most of which was done by YouGov, you will see that the majority of the British public do not want to see the US using UK bases to bomb Iran in what is clearly, for most people, an illegal war.
Behind you, there's these enormous B-52 aircraft that are infamous for carpet bombing Vietnam. They were also used to bomb Yugoslavia and Iraq, and the B-1 bombers that we've seen on the other side of the airfield. And these just trolleys of these 2,000-pound bombs, they're cruise missiles under the wings of the B-52s behind you as well. I mean, yeah, it doesn't really feel like a defensive operation from this base, does it?
No, it doesn't feel defensive whatsoever, and I think that's precisely the reason that they've put up all of this tarpaulin over the fences. When they see US soldiers on UK soil kind of nonchalantly just ferrying 2,000-pound bombs around the place, and to go and drop them in the context of an illegal war, I think a lot of the British public were quite shocked to see that. Now, they knew that the UK bases were being used within the context of the war in Iran, but to see these images, I think was very, very jarring for a lot of people, including myself. And it was very jarring to come here and see it in the flesh as well.
The US has over a dozen bases in the UK. Earlier this year, we filmed at another one, Lakenheath in Suffolk, and that's where the fighter jets were going on their way from the US out to the Middle East. So the UK has not just been complicit in allowing the bombers to be based here, it was also instrumental in letting the fast jets move out to the Gulf. And there's another base near Lakenheath called Mildenhall, where a lot of the refuelling and aerial surveillance aircraft have been going out from as well. There's lots more information on our website about American bases in the UK and Britain's role in this illegal war on Iran. If you like this video, don't forget to share it and subscribe to the channel. If you're able to donate to our journalism, please follow the link below. Thanks for watching.